Hello developers, testers, and everyone who loves game design.
Welcome to Studio Blues Podcast, DLC Not Included.
We're your hosts, Steele
And Teal.
Our podcast discusses game development and industry topics
In a relaxed fireside chat manner.
Alright, so let's talk a little bit about who we are and where we're from. We are Studio Blue. We've been collectively working on games for 10-15 years now.
Yeah.
I myself am a professional writer, been that way for about as long, and have been a published author since 2012.
I've been doing level design for over 10 years. I also do modding, NPC and AI scripting, and lighting.
So we bring to the table a variety of experience in game development. This podcast has been pretty well received so far. We're on our 4th episode.
Yay!
This particular topic today is one that's near and dear to my heart as a writer, but I feel we're both going to be able to talk about it since this has come up a lot in our channel, hasn't it?
It has. Even in our Discord chats, we've touched upon this topic.
So today's topic is creating a video game story. And that's really very important because if your game doesn't have a narrative,
then it's not interesting.
Players won't pick it up. What do we usually say? You have about 10 to 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 to 10 minutes to grab a player's attention, or you've lost them.
Yeah, and that narrative has to be part of that. So narratives can be real simple, can't they?
They sure can. Remember your old arcade games?
Yes.
Pac-Man, Pong, Space Invaders?
Yeah, let's go ahead and dissect those for a second.
Sure.
Pong would be basically a story of competition.
Oh, yeah.
Pac-Man is basically a survival game.
Yeah, that's true. The ghosts.
And Space Invaders is basically a defensive war.
True. Yeah. So even those games had a simple narrative.
Yeah, very simple. Then you move on to your more complex games as time goes on. Super Mario Brothers.
Oh, yeah.
That would be a rescue game. Zelda, which is basically a long fetch quest followed by a rescue.
That's true, yeah. Where's Zelda?
Then we get to our really complex games like our Final Fantasies.
Yeah, with their long plots.
Yes. Even if you break that down, the Final Fantasy games and the more complex RPGs still have a very basic narrative.
True.
Final Fantasy VI is basically Star Wars.
Yeah.
Kingdom Hearts, at its basics, is a exploration. Then you can get into games with really complex plots like the Metal Gear Solid series.
Yes, and their plots stretch over several games.
Several games and a lot of confusion.
True.
And the Nier games like Nier Automata.
Which I love. It's my personal favorite.
Yes. Those are very complex narratives. But at the heart, you still have a story.
Yes. You can have all the interesting side quests, fetch quests, etc. in your game. Window dressing, I call it. But if you don't have a good story, then your game is just not going to be played by a whole lot of people.
So I guess if you're going to build your narrative, the first thing you need to do is decide if you're going to be building a one-shot or a series. That is probably the most important thing. And I've learned that through novel writing. You don't build a one-shot and then try to build a series on it later. It has trouble.
Yes, because a one-shot, you've given it closure.
Exactly.
So how do you open it back up if you're going to turn a one-shot into a series? I haven't seen too many people be successful at that.
It would take a complete leap away from the original narrative while taking place in the same world. For example, The Hobbit. The Hobbit is a very self-inclusive story. It has what you call closure.
Yes, it does.
By the end, Bilbo Baggins has his treasure, Smaug is dead, and he goes back to the Shire and lives in Hobbit Town, a happy hobbit.
Right.
J.R. Tolkien could have finished. Stopped right then and there. But he wrote The Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
A successful, very successful trilogy.
Yeah.
He did that by shifting the narrative away from Bilbo's story to Frodo. So that's how you would do it in a video game. If you create a video game one-shot and it's so successful, your public wants more.
Right.
What you do is you move away from that narrative and create something new in that same world. What you don't do is you don't try to build upon it and complicate it just for the sake of continuing the story. And a game that illustrates that beautifully is actually my favorite game series, and that's Kingdom Hearts.
Because Kingdom Hearts One was actually just a one-shot. It was a story about a boy, another boy,
Right.
and a girl.
And a girl. And a duck and a dog.
And a duck and a dog. Who were seeking something.
Exactly.
And they found what they were seeking.
And that's a very good point. Everyone in Kingdom Hearts was seeking something. Sora was seeking Kairi. Riku was seeking Kairi. Donald and Goofy were seeking Mickey. Ansem was seeking the darkness.
Yes.
So you nailed the Kingdom Hearts main narrative. It is a story of seeking, exploration.
Right.
And it was intended to be a one-shot because Buena Vista and Square didn't know if Disney was going to sign on to anything else because it was such an ambitious project.
It was.
So they
and
had
all the licensing, too.
all the licensing, so they had to create the game as if it was going to be the only one. And Kingdom Hearts became insanely popular. So they needed to create more. So the creator, Nomura, had to start building off of a one-shot story. And that's where we get the hot mess that is the Kingdom Hearts storyline.
Oh my
With
gosh.
Organization 13 and Xehanort and the Keyblade Wars and all this other stuff that creates this really crazy overarching narrative. Now, I love it, but it's obviously band-aided together from a one-shot.
The execution of that was pretty bad because not only did you have full ride video games, but you had all these little side games on this platform and that platform, and oh, here's a mobile game on your phone, and somehow it all was supposed to tie into the Kingdom Hearts story. Nah.
Yeah. If you look at it from a design standpoint, it doesn't actually work. Kingdom Hearts 3 comes out in a day. And everyone who has been waiting for it has had to watch videos and play video games that have been sold in collections in order to remember and get their head wrapped around this story before going on Sora's final adventure.
So again, you want to start with your main question.
Right.
Is this a one-shot or a series?
Right. So let's shift over to a series that actually does it really well. We're going to do two games, both by the same company.
The first one is Dragon Age.
Which is by far one of our favorite series. Oh, man.
Wow.
I cannot say enough good things about Dragon Age because it handles its progression throughout the series so very well. And the thing is, by the way that they're doing it, by creating a world story...
Yes.
And then building the game stories to fit in like puzzle pieces, BioWare has literally created a series that can go on almost indefinitely.
Yes, because it so much reflects life in Thedas.
Exactly. So you have Origins, which dealt solely with the Fourth Blight.
Yeah.
And the game could have stopped right then and there, but they left it open.
They focused on just one country in this huge continent. Just one little place.
One conflict.
Yes.
Then when you go to Dragon Age 2, you go to a different area, Kirkwall.
Yes.
You see the overreaching consequences, the world consequences of the Fourth Blight, but it focuses on a different thing.
A different story. And from that, the Mage Templar War, they build on that and bring you to Inquisition.
Which is a phenomenal game because not only does it bring in parts of Origins and 2 into itself, but it gives you a world that gets even bigger. They're building upon the world. They have a world story. I squealed at the end of Trespasser. No, spoiler alert. With the whole thing with the Dreadwolf.
Yes, the Dreadwolf.
That blew my mind because they have they built themselves open doors to go there.
Yes.
And then they went there. Mm-hmm. And then at the very end when the Inquisitor slams the dagger into the table and you see Tevinter.
Yes.
Teasing that the next game's going to take place in this country that we've been hearing about since the first game.
Yes.
It's just mind-boggling.
And again, they started off by planning to make a series of games, not a one-shot. So they were successful.
They left the door open beyond Origins, so that if Origins was successful, which it was, they could create more. And they did this by creating a world narrative that they could build off of. Now, we're going to shift to BioWare's other property, which is more closed-scoped. and was built specifically to be a short series of games, and that's Mass Effect.
Oh, Mass Effect. Oh, yeah.
Mass Effect 2, and Mass Effect 3 tell the story of Commander Shepard, and they do it beautifully.
Oh, they do.
It's very obvious when they created Mass Effect that they intended to tell this story of Shepard versus the Reapers, and what the Reapers were, why they were destroying all life in the galaxy, etc., etc. And they had in their head a certain number of games. I don't know if they knew it was going to be 3, but they knew they wanted a certain number of games to tell this story. So they created Mass Effect with the plan to tell a multi-game story.
You know, most games that are series do end up being trilogies.
Yes.
I think it's just easier to manage if it's a trilogy.
It's easier to manage if it's a trilogy. That's the case with books, video games, most things.
Right.
Trilogies
right.
are really easy to manage.
I think so. So where do you start? Okay, so you've decided, I want to make a one-shot game, or I want to make a series. Where do you start?
You start the same place a writer starts when they're building their book. It's called an elevator pitch.
What is an elevator pitch?
An elevator pitch is a one-sentence summary that the redundancy department summarizes everything. So let's go ahead and do a elevator pitch for Kingdom Hearts. Final Fantasy meets Disney.
There it is.
That really is the elevator pitch.
Yeah, that is. Yeah.
That is. You can expand upon that by says, young chosen hero goes through Disney World with Final Fantasy characters to save his friends from the darkness. That's basically it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know? So you just want to create that elevator pitch. You want to create that one-sentence summary of what your story actually is. And this serves two purposes. One, it gives you that main scope that you're working from story-wise.
Keeps you focused.
Exactly. Write it down on a Post-it note, put it on the cover of your game notebook,
Right.
and always keep that in mind. The elevator pitch also has a second purpose. It's literally a pitch to other people so that they will know what your game is about in a very brief moment. It comes from the old adage of you get someone trapped in an elevator and you have the amount of time it takes for the elevator to go to the next floor to pitch your story.
That's it.
And actually, for any writers out there, that's actually a huge deal. You have to have your elevator pitch for your agent or publisher because they're not going to want to hear about your story, side tangent coming, where you go, okay, well, it's this great story that takes place in this medieval world, and then there's some country over here that's fighting this country over. No one's going to want to hear that.
Nope, it's too long.
When you're pitching your idea, whether it be for a book or a game or whatnot, you have one sentence. You give them that one sentence and you shut up, and then you wait for them to say, tell me more.
Yeah.
Because if they don't say tell me more, they're not interested. Move on to the next person.
So once you have your basic elevator pitch down, you want to refine it.
Absolutely.
So how do we refine it? You refine it by turning it into a higher level. Make a one-page summary of your story.
Yeah.
You can use placeholders, for your locations or your characters. You're not looking for detail here. You're looking for a summary of your story.
Exactly. Like Teal said, it's a high-level summary.
We have these 3 knight companions who are going to travel to this faraway land, grab the treasure, rescue the dragon, kill the princess,
Right.
and then come home.
Exactly. And thus you have the hero's journey. That is your story in a nutshell. Good job. You don't need a single detail. The only thing you're going to need are names of locations, names of characters, main sources of conflict, and the resolution of those conflicts.
That's it.
That's your high-level document.
That's all you need. It's very simple.
It really is. And you want that high-level document, again, for two purposes. One, it's like your elevator pitch, a reminder of what your basic narrative is. And two, if someone gives you that tell me more, you hand them that one-page summary and allow them to now digest what your story is in a nutshell.
Boy, that's an excellent way to be. It doesn't matter if you're a writer or a video game developer. Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. And thank you. I can't tell you how many times on our Discord server, Teal, we have asked people about their game, and they've started giving chunks here and chunks there, and it feels like they're randomly pulling stuff out of their head, trying to remember basics of their story,
Yeah.
Then we'll ask them questions, and while we're typing up their questions, they'll say something along the lines of, oh, and it also has this. Oh, and it also has that. And we're drowning.
Yeah, and the common reaction is,
Right.
You start looking away from the screen and thinking about what you're going to have for dinner.
Exactly. And that's not just us. That is a common human reaction. People do not like to get bogged down in unorganized details. And it's not because they dislike your story.
No.
It's because they have to organize what you haven't.
And that's hard.
It really is.
Please don't make it hard for the people you're pitching to.
Now, this is when you're pitching, not when you're discussing. When you're discussing and conversing, you can go all over the map. Conversations are meant to be fluid and disorganized.
That's where all your detail comes out. And that's later.
Exactly. So, what we have next is really important. And that is, building back to Dragon Age, it's your world framework. Because once you have your overall high-level story, you have to have a world your game takes place in.
So basically, we're going to start world building.
We are going to start world building. And that is its own podcast. That is its own topic. So let's just go over the real basics here. Let's keep it high level.
The high points.
The high points.
Okay.
Mythology.
Ooh, mythology, very important.
Cosmology. How was the world created?
Basic history. Your historical timeline of major events.
Exactly. The player doesn't necessarily need to know all this, but you need to know where the world came from and how it got to the state that it's currently in. You need to know things like the nations, if there are any. You need to know things like the ethnicity of the people, if there's a division, or if it's all homogenous. I want to bring back to a fantastic book trilogy that I absolutely loved, and that was Dave Duncan's The Seventh Sword Saga.
Oh, that's a good one.
That really is. It takes place in the world, which is a river going around a very long stretch of land, and a very homogenous group of islander people.
Okay.
I don't know how that world was created. I have absolutely no idea how the goddess came to be and how that world came to be. I know nothing of the geography beyond the river. I just happen to know what it is. Dave Duncan has all that other stuff in his head, and it influences his storytelling. So the reason I say that is to go back to the point. You have to have all of this stuff in the back of your head, even if it never comes out in the game, so that you know how different things will come about that influence your story.
When we say have it in the back of your head, we mean write it down.
Yes.
So it's all these details
that
you include in your world building.
Right.
And you don't have to have every single one of these come out in your game. You don't even have to allude to them. But as long as you know they're there, then you can build your own narrative, your framework, and your world more realistically.
In fact, I would go so far to say, Teal, that a good writer has all of that information ready to put into their narrative. But a great writer does not put it into their narrative. And instead allows it just to influence how their story comes out.
Boy, that does make for great games. It really does.
So you have your world. And so let's go to the next step, which would be the creation of your protagonist, your dertagonists, and your antagonists. Because now you got to start making the main dramatis persona.
These are the people that are going to drive your story, your plot forward from start to finish.
Now let's talk about protagonist for a second, because I have seen this warped all over the place.
Okay.
Your protagonist is your main character in that it's the character the story focuses on.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it's the main hero.
No, it does not, actually.
There's an anime called Goblin Slayer where the protagonist is actually not the hero of the story, but a support character.
I remember that one. That was actually refreshing.
Yes, it was.
There are other stories out there like that. For instance, Reciteer.
Reciteer is a fantastic example of a game where the protagonist is not the hero.
No. The protagonist is a girl who runs the item shop.
And that is amazing. So, when you create your protagonist, keep in mind that they're the ones who are going to move your main narrative forward through their action or agency, as we call it in writing, and that they don't have to be anything more than the hero of their own story. And that's a big thing we talk about with characters, and we'll get to that when we get to antagonists. Everyone's the hero of their story.
Yes.
They just don't have to be the hero of the story.
Thank you. Thank you. And that's a point that all of you should bear in mind.
So then we have our dirtagonists, which are also very important. Dirtagonists are your secondary characters that have a direct 1-degree relation to the protagonist.
Ah.
So let's talk about Final Fantasy VI for a moment.
Okay.
Because that one has one protagonist, and it is Terra.
Yes.
For the first half of the game. It is Terra. All the dirtagonists are just as important, but they move around Terra's story.
That's true.
When you get to the second half of the game, the protagonist shifts to Celis. You just opened up the story to all the dirtagonists,
Right.
which is the collection of every other character, finding them again, and then going to Kefka's Tower. So that is an example of a game that has a single protagonist per part of the story,
Right.
but its dirtagonists are so strong that line is blurred.
And they use the dirtagonist to drive the story forward to its climax at the end, confronting Kefka.
Exactly. Which culminates in that wonderful speech where everyone basically trash talks Kefka and tells him how wrong he is before they fight him. But it's a beautiful scene.
It is a good scene.
Because every single character brings out what they have learned, their personal character journey, and what the journey has done to them, and now they confront the Mad Clown God.
So there it is.
Much more clear-cut. Kingdom Hearts, going back to that one. Sora is the protagonist.
That is Steele's favorite game.
It
So
is.
you're going to be hearing about Kingdom Hearts a lot.
It is. And their protagonists are Goofy and Donald.
Yes, they are.
Then you'll have things like your tritagonists, which will be your characters that are 2 degrees removed. And those 2-degree removed characters do move the plot forward, but they move the plot forward in smaller amounts, and sometimes will give the main character, the protagonist, agency. Going back to Kingdom Hearts, that would be Riku, Kairi, King Mickey,
Right.
all those, Naminé, all those other characters. Those are all your tritagonists. After the tritagonists, you finally have your supporting cast.
So now let's talk about our favorite, the antagonist.
You have to have a good antagonist, and note that Teal and I are using antagonist and not villain.
There is a difference.
An antagonist is anyone who works directly opposed to the protagonist.
Yeah, that's it.
That's exactly what it is. They don't have to be bad guys, and we'll talk about that in a second, but they do have to work in some sort of opposition against your main character.
I have a good example. A young boy gets the call to adventure and he wants to go out. But his mother says no. He has to stay home and feed the goats.
Exactly.
That's his job.
His mother has just become an antagonist. When you're looking at those antagonists, it's everyone who at some point opposes the protagonist.
Yeah.
Now, you have to have a main antagonist, but it doesn't have to be a person.
No.
You can have man versus nature, man
Yes.
versus God, man versus himself, man versus fate. You can have all of those things. So your main antagonistic force doesn't have to be a person, but it has to be something that's defined.
Yes.
I think my favorite example of man versus himself is Anakin Skywalker.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you get one of the greatest villains in the history of science fiction based off of Anakin losing the
Yeah.
battle to the dark side.
Wow, what a well-told story.
And when you look at it, Palpatine is not really the main antagonist of
No.
the first 3 Star Wars movies. He's an agent of badness.
Yes.
He is an antagonist,
Yeah.
but the real villain is Anakin's dark side.
Yes, it is. He's fighting against his own dark side.
And he loses, which makes amazing storytelling and brings us to the original trilogy, 4, 5, and 6, where his son Luke has to save him.
Right. I like your point, Steele, but I want to go back and revisit why antagonists are important. It's because they provide the conflict in the story, and you don't have an interesting story unless you have conflict.
Exactly. That is very true.
So, to get back to your point, antagonists need to be as fully fleshed out as your protagonists and dirtagonists.
Exactly. When you're creating them, give them the same amount of love you give
Yeah.
everyone else. So when you finally have all of this, you have your world, you have your dramatis persona. Now it's time to get to the nitty-gritty of creating your full story. This is where you take all of the notes you've made and you start to outline how your story is going to flow.
You want to work within your world framework and your character framework, but take it in a good direction.
Exactly. Don't box yourself into a corner, for one. And we'll talk about pitfalls in a few minutes.
Right. You want to tell an interesting story using your refined elevator pitch as your starting point, pulling in your world building and your characters, your antagonists, and all of those people, and set it in motion.
Yeah.
What is it that these people are doing? Why are they doing it? Where are they going? And how are they getting there?
Exactly. Because regardless of what story you're telling, there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. Even your most open world games that just throw you into basically a sandbox have a direction and a conclusion.
Yes.
Let's talk about one of the games you're playing right now, Atelier Sophie.
Oh, yeah.
That is basically a sandbox game of collect stuff and fight monsters to get better stuff to fight more monsters.
Yes, actually it is. It's a whole series of fetch quests and crafting.
Yeah.
That's basically what it is. But it's an enjoyable game because the protagonist has a story. Her story is, I want to help my talking alchemy book restore her memories. Yay! Very simple story. But now the whole game is about how she goes about doing that.
Right. When you're creating your story, you want to create every scene in your game to move your story forward.
And if a scene is not moving your story forward, cut it.
Even if all the scene does is give you one little piece of information, or just as good, moves a character's journey forward, that's fine. But you can't have a scene that does nothing more than just fluff.
Yeah. I've seen too many games that, I'm not talking about just commercial releases, but also indie projects where you have a scene with 2 or 3 characters talking, and they're just going on and on and on, nattering about the color of bow somebody's wearing in their hair, and tee-hee and giggles, and this joke and that joke. And there's no point to that.
Exactly. A game that handles its scenes very well, despite the scenes being extremely long, is Xenogears.
Oh, yeah, Xenogears.
Now, Xenogears is the favorite game everyone's ever read.
Yes, it
because
is.
There are tons and tons of info dumps there. And it does
forever.
It does some of that very poorly. But every scene moves something, whether it's the plot, as thick and complex as that shit is, or a character story forward. Another real good one that also meanders and is more recent is Persona 5.
Ooh.
All those Persona 5 cutscenes move something forward, whether it be a character journey, whether it be Jokers or one of the supporting cast, or the main story forward, or reinforces what you've already learned through reminding a character who, Ryuji, doesn't remember things well, or telling a new character, this is what we've learned so far. So every scene either reinforces the world, moves the main story forward, or gives us more of a character's journey.
There's a point to every scene.
So to dial back to what Teal said, if something doesn't do one of those 3, reinforces the world, i.e. moves the world story forward, moves the main story forward, or moves a character story forward, cut it. It does not belong.
Right.
And that's also for character dialogue. I think it would be the same thing.
Oh, yeah. Like I said before, I hate sitting through scenes where characters are just nattering on and on about trivial stuff I don't care about. They're just joking back and forth. I don't know. It's just bullshit and time wasting.
It really is. It really is.
I don't want to sit there and hit X and go through all that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That, you know what? That brings us to pitfalls, actually.
It does. Pitfalls. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are tons and tons of pitfalls.
Yeah, there are.
That writers can fall into. We went ahead and we put about 5 or so.
About 5 or 6 down there.
So let's talk about the first one, the one that pisses me off the most.
Oh, yeah, still rant.
Writer convenience.
Oh, that's hateful.
Okay. Anyone who watches the Studio Blue LPs knows that nothing will get me to rant more and more than writer convenience.
Hear, hear.
What ticks me off is when people don't learn about it. So here's the rant ahead of time so that everyone who wants to develop a game will learn about what writer convenience is and why it sucks.
Take it away, Steele.
Writer convenience is when you as a writer create something, whether it be a plot hook, a character motivation, something that doesn't actually fit any of the outline framework. It doesn't fit the world. It doesn't fit the plot momentum. It doesn't fit a character motivation. It fits nothing other than you need something to happen. You need a character to die. So you have a murderer come out of nowhere and stab the person in the neck for no reason else other than you wanted that character to die. That murderer's never seen again. He's never caught. In fact, later on, it's not even talked about as a murder. It's just X and X character died. That's writer convenience.
Yeah.
Here's another writer convenience one that really gets me. When a person is of noble, or even better yet, royal ranking, and they go off on a journey, and everyone wishes them good luck.
Good luck!
And the sovereign of a country goes off to another country amidst a field of monsters, and nobody stops them and says, Your Grace, we're going to go with you, because if you die, our kingdom is hosed. That's writer convenience.
Oh, even better, when the crown prince goes off on this journey into this field all by himself with no guards and no military commanders, nothing. He's just by himself with a sword.
Writer's convenience. When the prince goes to his father's chamber to talk to him and the guards stop him with spears and say, Sorry, Your Highness, you can't enter because your father's having a private conversation. Just because you as the game designer don't want the player to talk to the king at that moment, that's writer convenience. So basically, I'm ragging on stuff that we've LP'd before, by the way.
Yeah.
Anytime you have something happen because you need it to happen with no explanation other than I just need the plot to go this way, that's writer convenience. And that is a mortal sin for writers.
Thank you.
That is the kind of thing that will get people to stop taking your book or game seriously immediately. And when you lose someone to writer convenience, you lose your street cred with them because you're at that point just seen as a lazy writer.
And those people talk. So if you lose one person, you've lost 10.
Yeah. And the next one is adding too many elements to your game, whether they be borrowed or not. And this is a pitfall that a lot of new developers, new game writers fall into. So borrowed elements would be things like, hey, I like the draw system from Final Fantasy VIII, or I like the romance system from Mass Effect, or I like the synthesis system from Kingdom Hearts.
Yeah.
I'm going to use all of these. So that can also go to story elements. You can take story elements from either other sources or your own brainstorming, and you can put so much in that everything starts to get cluttered.
Yes. For example, you've got romances and airship pirate adventures, and I want to have Captain Nemo in this.
Exactly. And the next thing you know, you're having to force these pieces to fit, which will drive you to writer's convenience.
Yep. And guess what, guys? You can't fit a round peg into a square hole.
You can't do it. You need to put the elements in after you've developed your story, doing all the stuff we've talked about previously in this podcast.
Yeah.
Don't do, I want to have X, Y, and Z in my game and then start developing your story. Develop your story, then decide what you want to put into it. That helps move the story forward. A great example is the romance and rivalry/friendship system in Dragon Age 2.
Yes, because who you oppose, be friends with, romance, influences the direction that the story goes in.
And a beautiful example of that is Pirate Captain Isabella.
There we go, yeah.
How you treat her in Act 1 and most of Act 2 influences whether or not she sticks around for the rest of the story.
Yep, and if you don't have Isabella in your final battle, you screwed up!
Yeah, because her and Finish are like your best DPS characters. Let's just call it like it is. I'm sorry, they dropped the ball with Anders hard, and Meryl ain't got it.
Anders and Meryl.
So, to double back, the way you treat Isabella influences whether or not she's in your story, and you could potentially lose her for the entirety of Act 3 and the rest of the game.
Which, I've done that in a playthrough, actually, and it does suck, actually.
And how your character relates to Anders is very important for that pivotal scene at the climax of the game when he blows up the cathedral. Yeah. And how you deal with what he's done. Depending on your relationship with Anders, how you handle letting him go, drafting him, dismissing him, exiling him, or killing him. How that plays out depends on how you've built up your relationship with him the whole time. In one playthrough, I romanced Anders and decided to kill him, and it was very heart-wrenching. It was very heart-wrenching when Hawk pulled out her dagger and stabbed Anders in the back.
Yeah.
And also, if you have the DLC character Sebastian, you can't keep Sebastian and Anders.
No, you can't.
So you could have a heartbreaking scene there if you become best friends with Sebastian.
Yep.
So the reason I use Dragon Age 2 is it shows that they created their story and crafted their elements around how the story would move forward.
Yes, they did. It wasn't the other way around with the tail wagging the dog. They actually thought very carefully their story progression, and then they brought in the romance friendship element to add movement to the story.
Exactly. Let's move on to our next point. Needing to explain things out of the game.
If you got to do that, then you screwed up, buddy.
Basically. We don't have to dwell on this one too much. If you have to explain, and I'm not talking about clarify, we'll get to that in a second. If you have to explain anything to your players, you have failed as a writer.
Yep.
Your players, like your readers if you're writing a book, need to be able to understand what's happening and need to be able to extrapolate based off of your writing what is happening and what is being said. Now, that doesn't mean they have to understand every nuance.
Right.
So let's go ahead and clarify that. For example, I didn't need to know how Riku got into Hollow Bastion, how he was found by Maleficent, and how he ended up with Maleficent and the bad guys when Sora finally meets him in the revisit of Traverse Town.
Right.
I didn't need to know all of that, but I did need to know that by that point Maleficent had been working on him and had been turning his heart against his best friend.
Right.
Because that drives Riku's character story forward, not just for the first game, but the entire series.
Sure.
Turning him into actually a great antagonist.
Yes, very much so.
So the dialogue between Riku and Sora when you first reconnect with Sora in Traverse Town, where he kills a Heartless and then sees that Sora has the Keyblade and then sees that Sora's teamed up with Donald and Goofy, and there's a little bit of going on where you as the player are kind of like, something's not quite right with Riku here. He doesn't quite feel like he's being as friendly. There's a coldness to him.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Sora goes waddling off with Donald and Goofy, and then the camera pulls back, and you see Riku talking to Maleficent, and you're like, oh, shit.
And Maleficent is feeding into Riku's jealousy and envy.
Exactly.
That, Sora's found a new best friend.
So from seeing that, I don't need to know all the details of what happened to Riku. I'm able to fill in the blanks that Riku ended up in a bad place and this horrible, evil woman is now poisoning his heart. But if that wasn't there, and I just saw Riku later on opposing Sora, I would be like, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And if the creator of Kingdom Hearts then got out and said, well, he was, when Maleficent was poisoning his heart, then the creator of Kingdom Hearts would have failed in the story.
Right.
So that kind of drives us back to their point. If you have to explain any motivation or story element, you have failed as a writer.
Yep.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit about clarification. When you're developing your story and you're going through things like peer review, whether it be through one of our LPs or putting your work in front of other people for review, clarifying a point is different. If we or any critiquer critiques a work and that person comes back and says, well, let me clarify.
Right, clarify.
Then it allows us, the critiquer, to critique more properly. We may still stand by what we say and say, I'm sorry, but that still doesn't work, but thank you for clarifying. Or we may go, okay, well, now that we understand that, let's critique it properly. Instead of the suggestion A, we're going to make suggestion B. So there's a difference between excusing, making an excuse, and clarifying. Okay, so this next one is really big for anyone, whether they want to design a small game or an epic. And that's not enough or too many characters, plots, conflicts, etc. That's subjective to each game.
Yeah, if you put too much stuff in your game, you just overwhelm your player and people feel you've got a hot mess. A good example of this is a game that I played not too long ago that had a crafting system, lots of side quests. It had a mini game, an ongoing mini game. The main plot, several subplots, a romance system, and a pet system.
And it's just, that's too much. That's too much. A really good example of a game that doesn't have enough is a game that I've played recently. Teal and I are not naming the games. Where it was a single character going through a maze.
Yeah.
And there was one or two side characters.
That's it, yeah.
That's just not enough for the type of game that developer was trying to tell. Now let's talk about a game that has very few characters and does it well.
Okay.
A Silent Hill series.
Oh, yeah.
Silent Hill 3 being Teal and I's favorite.
Yeah, because you just have the one protagonist, Heather, going through the creepy town.
Right. You have the one side character, the one protagonist, Douglas. And you have Vincent and Claudia. And that's it.
Antagonists.
Right. And that's it.
That's it. You have 4 characters.
Right. So, in a survival horror game like Silent Hill, which wants to feed upon feelings of isolation and hopelessness, having a very small cast with a small-scale plot is really good.
Yes, it is.
Silent Hill would not work if it had a cast of hundreds with a world-shaking storyline.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, it's not an epic. And it would also fail if you had all these mini-games and fetch quests and a crafting system.
Imagine now Heather doing the bowling mini game with a song going while Heather's trying to pick up that spare on that 7-10 split. They got a crafting system where Heather's sitting there synthesizing materials to make her gun better. It would be a horrible game.
Yes, it would. Wow, yeah.
Now, a game that has a big cast that we've both played is Final Fantasy VI. Going back to that one.
Going back to Final Fantasy VI.
It's so large that when you go into the final dungeon, you have to split your party into 3.
Yes.
3 different parties going around doing switches. And we're not talking about the mechanics of the final dungeon.
No.
The game's just that big. It opens up a list of the order in which characters will fight against the final boss before you fight Kefka.
Yes, it does.
You have not seen this once the entire game. It opens up a freaking list, and you choose this character first, this character second, this character third, and if somebody falls, they're replaced by the next person if you move to the next tier of the final battle.
Yeah.
I never felt like there were too many characters.
Nope.
I always felt like there was just enough. And the epilogue, the ending, before the ending credits, when they're escaping Kefka's tower, you get closure for every single character.
Yeah, you do.
So, depending on the game you're trying to tell, and the setting and the world, that will determine how many characters you should have, how many plots you should have, how many conflicts you should have.
Yeah.
Don't overdo it, don't underdo it. Find the one that's right for your particular game.
Well, let's go over our last pitfall.
Yes, our last one is being afraid of partial or complete revisions or rewrites. And this, for me, is the biggest one as a writer.
Yeah.
But I believe wholeheartedly this extends to a developer.
Yes, it does.
People are afraid, especially new ones, are afraid of having to scrap parts or holes of their work and start over. And if you want to be a successful game developer or successful writer, you can't be. I was given a piece of advice by my first publisher who said, Steele, if you're not ready to throw out your entire manuscript and start over from page 1, you're not ready to be an author. And that was a very painful pill to swallow.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell a quick story.
Okay. Story time.
My very first book that actually went to publication, before it went to publication, was a hot mess. It was all over the place. It very unelegantly shifted genres and was way too long.
Yeah, it was.
Way too long. So, under the advice of my editor at the time, I went ahead and completely scrapped keeping my notes and rewrote the book into a trilogy.
Yeah.
I didn't take and go, okay, we're going to go to this chapter and stop. I went and wrote, brought a conclusion to the first book, left enough open to bring into the second, and then proceeded to do that for the second and then the third. Everything from the slow shift in setting and genre to the motivation of the characters was then handled very well. My first book is now an Amazon bestseller. So it took a very painful rewrite.
Yeah. The one piece of advice I was told by all of your author friends is your first draft that you write of any story is crap. Absolute crap.
Yeah, it's a turd.
And you're going to be rewriting it multiple times in order to get it to some semblance of decency.
Yeah. So the same thing can be said about games. And here's the difference in psychology that I have seen between developers, at least in the indie community, and writers. The writers that I know in my personal circle, offline, have come to the point in their journey where they're willing to do these rewrites. Where revision can be, yes, as simple as changing a couple of sentences to as complex as rewriting entire chapters or sections.
Yes.
A lot of developers that Teal and I deal with appear to not want to do more than just tweak a line here, tweak a line there. And that's, I don't want to call it hubris. We're not here to insult people. It seems to be, from our standpoint, more afraid of doing it.
I think it's fair. It really is, because you feel like you've put so many hours into this project, and to just scrap your writing and your story and start over is horrifying.
It is. You feel like you've wasted your time. You feel like you're no good.
Yeah.
You feel like you should just quit and never come back to it.
Right.
And you can't, especially when you put your work out there for criticism from either peers or your peers
right.
in the community. You have to be ready to take their criticism and, if necessary, rewrite entire chunks of your story.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't, your story's not going to grow. You can't Band-Aid a game.
You can't.
It will not work.
Well, it all comes down to, you've got to be willing to take the criticism, the feedback, and make the improvements to your game, your story.
Yeah.
That's all it boils down to. People want you to succeed, okay? Not 9 out of 10 people want you to succeed. That 10th person is asleep at the bar.
Right.
So they're giving you this feedback for a reason. They want your game to be good. Do it. Jump in there and do what needs to be done.
Now, we do recognize that not every piece of feedback is going to work, obviously. But the point that we're getting at that brings us back to being afraid is, when you receive a piece of feedback that you know in your head is going to result in revision or rewriting, don't be afraid to do it.
Yeah.
Because your work will be better.
Yes, it will be.
So there are a lot more pitfalls in this. These are the ones that we feel are the largest and can be the most devastating, especially to new developers.
So that pretty much wraps up our discussion on creating video game stories.
It really does. What do you think? Is there anything that we particularly missed? Anything that you don't agree with? Anything that you feel the budding game writers out there need to know that will make their craft the absolute best that it can be?
Yeah. Or if you want us to make a podcast out of a certain topic. Some of these do lend themselves to a full podcast. So let us know.
Yeah, let us know. All right. Well, we want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast. We've received great reception, and we love y'all to death. So join us next time for DLC Not Included. And remember,
anyone can give you the key, but you have to go through the door.